It was the hurricane heard round the world. But the Katrina story is far more complex than most remember, and that's where I come in. So many twists and turns and malfunctions and negligence and needless suffering, and all blamed on this one storm. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. Was Katrina responsible for it all? This day in weather history. Believe it or not, it all started on August 23rd, 2005, about 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, this day in weather history, when Tropical Depression 12 formed near the Bahamas. The next day, the Tropical Depression strengthened and was upgraded to Tropical Storm and was named Katrina on the morning of August 24th. The day after that, Katrina became the fifth hurricane of the 2005 season on the 25th, only 2 hours before it made landfall about 6:30 p.m. in Florida. The now newly minted Hurricane Katrina struck the peninsula with 80-mile-per-hour winds. That's about 130 kilometers per hour, and already had a very well-defined eye on weather radar. That eye stayed intact throughout its entire passage over the Sunshine State. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective. And oftentimes, they will include visuals from that day's event, from when it happened, in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. The Florida Keys were whipped by tropical storm force winds that continued through the 26th, but Katrina was still churning up momentum in the Gulf. Although Katrina did not necessarily strengthen any as it passed over the state of Florida, it at least held on to its hurricane status. Once off land and back into the bathtub that is the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, it was then allowed to rapidly intensify and become the 6th strongest Atlantic hurricane in recorded history. The National Weather Center initially had forecast that Katrina was going to begin turning northward after landfall in Florida and eventually hit the Panhandle in the coming days. But Katrina did not do that. This storm went on to rewrite history, and in an age of new media and advanced digital technology, was burned into the screens and the memories of the world as it hooked southwesterly and eventually shifted the forecast track to New Orleans. For today, that's where our story ends. Be with us on August 29th when Katrina makes landfall in coastal Louisiana near the Mardi Gras center of the universe, New Orleans, because that is a different story for a different This Day in Weather History. I know, I can hear you all out there. Boo! What happened next? I'm going to bet most of you had no idea or didn't remember that there were actually 6 days separating the day Katrina was named and the day that it started dominating every news station's attention around the world. You know how you watch a movie and for years after you recount the story and recite the lines because you know that story, you know that movie. Then one day you pull out that old VHS. Okay, I'm dating myself. And then you watch it back only to find that the lines didn't go exactly the way that you remembered it, and the story did not necessarily go the way that you recall. We're going to reopen your eyes when we retell the details of that day in weather history. That's the August 29th, Part 2 conclusion of the hurricane called Katrina. Hey, do you like the podcast? We'd love to hear from you. If you have an idea, go right now to wherever you're listening to me and rate us if you would, please. It's on a 5-star system, and we would love as many stars as you can afford. So rate us, but then also review us. This way we can always stay on top of how you'd like to see the show evolve. Then remember to subscribe to this podcast. Click the subscribe or follow button right there on the very same podcast homepage you're listening on. You'll be immediately reminded that the next day is ready to listen to, and you also have access to every episode in the archives. It dates back to June 1st of 2020, so there is a lot that we got to get caught up on this day in weather history. Tomorrow is August 24th, and for this day, I'm going to attempt something that I haven't tried yet. I haven't done this yet. We're going to go farther back in time than I have ever gone before. Get ready. We're going all the way back to the year 79. Yep, 79 AD. That was when the deadliest volcano eruption in European history took place. It still stands today. And the explosion we're talking about was the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. This day in weather history with me, your host, Chris May.